Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, welcome to the first virtual meeting of Washington Conservation Guild season. I'm Rachel Greenberg, the president of WCG. Really quickly, sorry, I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Hope you can all see that. I just wanted to quickly thank a few of our sponsors and supporters that have made it possible for WCG to continue our educational programming. This year funding is going towards speaker honoraria, which we sometimes have on and off been able to offer over the years. It's going to venue fees, which keep going up in price. And this season, we're doing some special events and workshops. So keep an eye out for announcements on those. I'd like to thank Kramer Pigment, Smithsonian National Collections Program, and University Products for sponsoring us so far this year. If you're interested in sponsoring WCG, please get in touch with me, or you can visit our website to get more information. Stop sharing for a moment. Okay. I'd also right now just like to quickly announce the recipients of the season's Williston Fund for Emerging Professionals. So if they are here and you do want to turn on your cameras, please go ahead. We had a fantastic pool of applicants this season, and it was really difficult to narrow down to only 5 recipients, but we're really happy to announce the following 5. Laura Bergman. She's a conservation science intern at the Smithsonian Museum Conservation Institute. Sejal Goel is a postgraduate fellow with the National Park Service at Harper's Ferry. Daniela Gonzalez Pruitt is a graduate intern in paintings at the Walters. Ife Iboji is a pre-program conservation intern at the Smithsonian Library and Archives. And Hannah Longbottom Estrada is intern at the Phillips Collection. So congratulations to all of them. And we'll be hearing a little bit more from them throughout the season, hopefully even getting to hear about some of their research projects at our Emerging Professionals meeting in the spring. I just want to remind everyone that we have the Safety and Cultural Heritage Summit coming up being hosted at the American Art Museum. That is taking place on October 27th. Registration deadline, I believe, is the 17th of this month. So please go to our website. You can find a link there. And just before I hand it off tonight, I just want to say I'm really excited about hearing tonight's talk on the Kinetic sculpture race in Baltimore. This past race in May was the first time that I got to go, and I found it really exciting. And in kind of conjunction with tonight's meeting, WCG is planning kind of a day out at the upcoming race, which is taking place on Saturday, May 4th, 2024. So hopefully you'll all be able to join us for a day out in Baltimore. Keep an eye out for that announcement in the spring. And now I will hand it over to one of WCG's directors, Linda Owen. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. So I would like to introduce our 2 speakers tonight. We have Tom Jones and Joe Wall. They will be presenting Baltimore Kinetic Sculpture Race, Maintaining Amphibious Art Machines. Tom Jones has been an integral part of the Baltimore Kinetic Sculpture Race since 2004, when he spontaneously created its official website to support and grow the racing community and encourage public participation. Since then, he leads the team of all-weather photographers who document each year's race in Baltimore, and has also attended 4 Kinetic Grand Championships in Humboldt County, California, representing Baltimore. Tom and his team have twice been awarded Spirit of the Glorious Founder, and Tom was ordained a Kinetic Seer by the original Kinetic Sculpture Race founder, Hobart Brown. He lives in Greenbelt with his wife, Joanna, and works for University of Maryland. Joe Wall has been working with the American Visionary Art Museum in a variety of capacities since 1998, when he came on board as a performer for museum events, then created and realized interactive art installations for the museum. In 2004, he was hired for a year-long community arts program to extend the museum's architectural mosaic and served as project engineer, materials engineer, and overall construction supervisor for the mosaic, staying on to manage the museum facility until 2009. Joe has additionally served as manager for several adaptive reuse arts facilities, including the Broma Seltzer Arts Tower, where he worked to conserve and restore the original Seth Thomas clock mechanism and the building itself, managed a community theater, and now works primarily for the University of Maryland while still maintaining close ties to ABAM. So during the presentation, if you could put questions in the chat, and they will be asked in the question and answer period at the end, but I will say that Joe welcomes questions during his session. So if he kind of prefers it to be a little more interactive. So if you have a question, you can just go ahead and unmute and ask the question. So I will now pass it off to Tom and Joe, and thank you again for presenting. We're really looking forward to it.
Hey, good evening. All right, can you see my screen now? All right, thank you. So yeah, the presentation that we're giving tonight is Maintaining Amphibious Art Machines, and I'm Tom Jones, and in a moment you'll meet Joe Wall. There's a picture of Joe and me at the Kinetic Sculpture Race. This was a couple years ago, but it shows some of the crazy festivity that's involved. And as mentioned, I'm the Baltimore Kinetic Webmaster and Archivist, and Joe is a Special Projects Consultant to the American Visionary Art Museum. I'll quickly go through the topics we'll be covering tonight. First is, what's a kinetic sculpture race? Because it's not as easy a question to answer as one might think. And then a very brief history of kinetic sculpture racing from California to Baltimore. I'll mention 3 challenges of racing, which also impact the kinds of materials that sculptures are made out of. Go into a little bit about our website and photography. And then Joe will talk about sculpture maintenance, what the machines are made of, the life of a kinetic sculpture, the afterlife of a kinetic sculpture, and we'll wrap with some information about preparing for a visit next year at the race on May 6th, 2024. By the way, this picture shows the grand champion, Mr. John Diggett, which was last year's champion, well, the race in May of this year. And actually, I'll go back a moment. This picture that I showed of Joe and me earlier was taken by Howard Wellman, who I'm not sure if he's on tonight, but I know he is a WCG member, and I think may have done the initial introduction that led to tonight's presentation. So the first question is, what's a kinetic sculpture race? And to explain that, it's an organized contest of human-powered, amphibious, all-terrain works of art. It's a it goes back to when the race was created. Obviously, a lot of people know what a kinetic sculpture is. Like a mobile is a type of kinetic sculpture, but those aren't used in racing. In racing, they are always human-powered. They also go into the water. They have to work over water and all kinds of terrain. And it is also highly desirable that they be a work of art, that they not just be mechanical, unless the mechanical operation is so fascinating that it itself constitutes a work of art. This photo cover is the art winner from this year's race, cut out to be royal, and it shows it on the water with the paddles and the large wheels. I'll give a brief history of kinetic sculpture racing now. That was back in 1969 in Ferndale, California, which is in Humboldt County. You probably think of San Francisco as Northern California, but Humboldt County in Ferndale, you have to drive 5 hours north from San Francisco to get there. There's a lot of California that is well north of San Francisco. It's out in the middle of it's quite rural. It's they sometimes refer to themselves as being behind the redwood curtain. It also is the kind of community that has a long-running, healthy culture of artists and tinkerers who have a tradition of selling their creations in galleries along Main Street. And that collection of galleries along Main Street is where the kinetic sculpture race originated. So artist Hobart Brown was one of those sculptors. His son had a tricycle, and for reasons that aren't entirely known to history, he upgraded his son's tricycle to a pentacycle. He welded finials on it. He put curlicues on a homemade steering wheel, and you may see the Surrey-like roof that's on top of it. He created this unusual version of his son's tricycle, And then his neighbor, who was also an artist and was probably a better welder than Hobart, Jack Mays, challenged Hobart to a race. He said, I think I can do better than that, and challenged him to that race 2 blocks down Main Street in Ferndale. The two of them quickly came upon 5 rules. It had to be 100% people power, no cheating, no using any kind of machines. Feet can't touch the ground because otherwise it's not as much fun. You have to finish in order to win, which seems pretty logical. And you can have between 1 and 5 drivers per entry, at least 1 and no more than 5, to be clear on both ends. And it also must not be dangerous, at least to other people. And so those are the rules that they settle upon. Hobart immediately started publicizing it. He was kind of a showman. He dressed fancy, wore a top hat, and was regularly engaging in publicity all the time. He spoke to everyone who came into his gallery and said, "Hey, have you heard that there's going to be a race here in a couple of weeks? Maybe you should come and join, or even better, maybe you should enter." So he also got the race approvals from the city. He told everyone he knew about it. He got some newspapers to do coverage of it. And so it actually turned out to be a pretty big and exciting event. That first race had 12 participants in it. And the winner was neither Hobart nor Jack. And I was not there. I was conceived but not yet born, so I was not able to attend the race. But I'm not even sure Hobart really finished. I think his sculpture may have suffered a breakdown before it got those 2 blocks. But the winner, there is no dispute, was Bob Brown, who had built an egg-laying tortoise, which he had navigated as a one-pilot sculpture. But it was so much fun for all involved that everyone immediately agreed that they should do it again. So they decided to make it an annual event. Over the following years, from 1970 to 1998, and I'll explain why it ends at that point a little later on, the Kinetic sculpture race in California grew dramatically. By the mid-70s, it had grown from 2 blocks to 38 miles. From the town of Arcata that's at the north end of the race course, through the town of Eureka and into Ferndale, which is the smallest of the towns. And here's a map. It shows some of the interesting stuff that was going on. It also took 3 days. By the end of the 70s, it was a 3-day race. And so some of the advantages of extending the race out to 3 days are that that you could have some parties. And so the first night, sometimes racers are frantically rebuilding their sculptures if they suffer a breakdown, or reassessing what's going on, or maybe they're just laying back and chilling. The second night, there is an organized party on the beach. And this is a picture from that party. And this wooden structure here that is shaped like it has the Kinetic chicken wings at the top, and the start and the current year is a wooden platform that was designed to be used as a bonfire. So later on, this sculpture, which is also filled with wood scraps, became a giant bonfire that ended out the party that night. So with 3 days, it turns into quite a celebration, both for the racers and for the public who come to spectate. They also added a water crossing. This was when it became amphibious. And so this picture is from 2018 when I was out there, but they crossed 2 miles of Humboldt Bay. Sometimes the crossing changes, sometimes they go with the tide, sometimes they go against it. They try to be challenging, but reasonably safe. And so sometimes the route changes based on the tides and based on other factors that are involved. So the water crossing is always one of the more sophisticated parts of the race. You'll see some of the challenges later on in some other photos where it's not always easy. Because they go in the water, they also follow, there's also a sand entry. And sand presents some extra challenges, especially for traction. And so they start out by going along the flat beaches. That's the Pacific Ocean in the background. This team in 2018 came from Lowell, Massachusetts. Their team, it's called Lobster Roll. They came from Massachusetts all the way to California with their machine in order to conduct the entry. And so, yeah, that's the Pacific Ocean behind them. But not all the sand is flat. They decided to also include in the race course a very steep, large dune called Dead Man's Drop. That was the name it developed because it is at the angle of repose. Sand cannot get steeper than that without collapsing. If you look at this picture, you'll see crowds at the top, and you'll see a very steep angle, and you'll see this sculpture, which was called Caltrans Solid Gold Pineapple Wrecking Crew, which had fallen off the race course and driven into a bush. It's very challenging to navigate such a steep downhill. In fact, being at this spot was a pretty risky spot in order to just take this picture. I got special permission because they trusted me to be able to dash out of the way if the sculpture ran out of control, and so all the risk was on me to be there. But so as the race gathered all these interesting characteristics, it got more and more coverage over time, and it was actually featured a few times on Good Morning America. I think this still image here was from Good Morning America. It's one of Hobart Brown's sculptures. It was the people-powered bus. And it's an extremely choppy seas here with very strong winds. You can see the flags are blowing straight out. You can see this video on YouTube. As I understand it, the Coast Guard was already on duty, which I hope is one of the reasons that Hobart was actually willing to push this non-ocean worthy craft out into the water with actual people on it, including himself. But the Coast Guard ended up rescuing them. And the national television audience included one special person in Baltimore, who was Teresa Segretti of the American Visionary Art Museum. She had a copy of this Good Morning America episode on VHS, and with a senior role at the Visionary Art Museum, she contacted Hobart to see if we could create a race on the East Coast using the same ideas and concepts that were already on the West Coast. So Teresa brought Hobart to Baltimore to lay out a race course through the urban streets, parks, and harbor. That was in 1998. And the first race in Baltimore was 1999. And ever since then, Teresa Segretti is known as Kinetic Mother Teresa in Baltimore. This picture shows the Cha-Cha bird, which was the Visionary Art Museum's entry that first year. This is, in fact, the only and best picture I could get of the Cha-Cha bird. I wasn't there that first year. So the Baltimore race course was created. This is a map that I created to show the race. It's only 15 miles long, but that's more than enough. It only lasts for 6 hours, but that's also more than enough if you talk to any of the racers. On a nice, not too warm year with clear skies like 2023, the race can take 5 hours. Last year, it was a stormy, cold, rough year with winds at times, and a lot more things can go wrong. Sculptures that are made out of fabric became incredibly heavy. It can take 6 or 7 hours, and bad weather also means that fewer teams actually cross the finish line. Baltimore has its own water crossing. This is 2001. This is Fifi, which is the Cha-Cha bird in 2000 was rebuilt into the Fifi in 2001, which is, of course, a pink French poodle, and Fifi still races every year. You'll see some later pictures of Fifi. Fifi has become the museum's own entry and is the official race mascot. The Baltimore race also includes sand. This shows in Patterson Park, north of the water entry, there's a sand crossing. This shows Tick-Tock the Croc last year crossing the sand. And the mud is the most significant challenge in Baltimore. That reflects it's not a very long crossing, but the team of volunteers that build the mud do their best to make it as challenging as possible. They want it to be viscous enough that sculptures will have a great deal of trouble driving through it, but not so viscous that they just ride on top of it. They work carefully to make it so that it is as challenging as possible, and the racers find it very, very challenging. You can see in this case that the team, several of the racers have actually gotten off to push the sculpture. There was also 1 year where the Kinetic Sculpture Race in Baltimore went on ice. This is the only ice crossing in the history of Kinetic Sculpture Racing. It was at the Patterson Park Ice Rink. So the sculptures had to cross the ice with their best traction that was available. It was an ice rink, so it was flat. At least they didn't have to climb. But they were only able to do that 1 year because in subsequent years the race was moved a little bit later because it still tends to be cold in April, so they moved the race, and it's ever since then been the first Saturday in May when the weather's a little bit better. So if you're interested in seeing kinetic sculptures on ice, you missed your chance back in 2002. So that's the layout of the race. Next, I'll give an incredibly small sample of what's needed to be in the race in case you're planning on building your own entry. I'm going to highlight 3 challenges of racing, which are physics, stamina, and project management. So it's an incredible amount of fun to be in the race, but it also requires serious work to design, build, and race a sculpture. If you don't have skills when you start building it, you will by the end. In the next 3 slides, I'll quickly review these 3 challenges, but I also want to stop a moment for this photo. This is my favorite kinetic sculpture race photo of all time, and I've got some hundreds of thousands of them. This picture was taken by my friend, the late, great Andy Carruthers, who was a professional journalist photographer who served on our Kinetic Baltimore team. This was from 2008 of Wilma and the Wombats. It has 4 people piloting it. They weren't just kinetic sculpture pilots. They were also a 4-piece Dixieland band. You can see the drums, you can see the horn. When they were out on the water, they were playing music and having a great time while they were also pedaling and paddling in order to move the sculpture through the water. This was one of the most dramatic and exciting sculptures that has ever been entered. Adding a Dixieland band is not something that most racers do, but they did a great job of it. And so this picture, I think, was the most dramatic moment of that year's race when they crashed into the water at full speed. And you can see there was a huge wake, there was a giant splash, and then they got right to playing the music. So the first of those 3 challenges is physics. So anybody can build a float. In a parade, a float is usually something that's towed behind a vehicle or is wrapped around a vehicle like a pickup truck. Those are easy because they're self-propelled, but they're powered by gas or electricity or something that isn't a person. Building a human-powered sculpture is hard because you need it to be a lot lighter. If a sculpture weighs twice as much, it takes twice as much energy to push it. And especially for the amphibious part, you have to worry about a lot of additional characteristics that come out on the water, because suddenly buoyancy, suddenly all of the different physics that are involved in balancing a sculpture on the water and propelling it forward and steering it through the water come into play. And physics cannot be fooled, to paraphrase Richard Feynman. You'll see the boat behind this fire truck that tipped over is the Baltimore City Fire Department rescue boat. That firefighter who you can see leaning on the edge there, he's getting ready to dive in. And a few moments later, he was in the water and helping to turn this sculpture right side up again because it completely inverted. This sculpture, by the way, was this year. It was Engines and Dragons. And they were not expecting to tip over, but the way the physics work out, they suffered mightily. You can see if you look at the bottom of the sculpture that they have a lot of flotation down the center line. They did not have a lot of lateral flotation on the outboard portions like pontoons, and that was one of the key errors that they made. From my observations, every year there's a pretty good chance that at least 1 and sometimes 2, 3, or 4 sculptures will have a dramatic capsize. They usually fall into 2 categories. The first category is novices who never really tested their sculptures on water and were just hoped that they could navigate their way around without having to worry about it. The second are seasoned veterans who have raced before and they get a little overconfident. So this sculpture was never going to sink. It had plenty of flotation, but most of its flotation was right along the front to back axis, and so it lacked stability and rolled right over. There's a lot about physics here. This is not a presentation about physics, but if you want to learn more about how this kind of thing happens, go check out kineticbaltimore.com, where I actually include links to a U.S. Navy Academy textbook that explains how you need to design a boat so that this does not happen.
Yeah, and we should Tom should blow his own horn here for proposing the whole pontoon effect thing, that if one pontoon isn't able to support the whole vehicle, it's not going to be stable.
Yeah, one of the things you can watch for during the race, if you have 2 pontoons, 1 on each side, the moment one pontoon is all the way under the water, it is no longer providing any leverage. And so So unless they embark upon drastic motion and shake things real hard, once one pontoon goes all the way under, they will flip over. So a well-designed pontoon will, when a sculpture is sitting at rest, be no more than halfway under the water, or else they are risking a lot of trouble. And if you want to have a good margin of error, it's good to be like 30 to 40% under the water. Good point, Joe. Then the next of the three challenges is stamina. I want to emphasize this is an athletic event for the racers. Pedaling a heavy sculpture for 15 miles is exhausting. If you take a look at, this is the same wombat that was entering the water a few slides ago. These racers are quite exhausted. They've run out of energy. They were also playing music, and I don't think they were. I think they spent more time playing music than doing strenuous exercise. So they needed some help here. The yellow shirt on the woman in the back, you can see that was my fiance at the time. She is now my wife. She was helping push the sculpture to the finish line. We do whatever it takes to make the race a success. We aren't just a photography team. We build the website. We help encourage spectators to understand what they need in order to see the race. And sometimes we actually get in and push the sculptures when they need it. The third category challenge of the race is project management. It takes a lot of work and a lot of clever design to enter the race. It's serious project management. You need to have skills in engineering, in art, in logistics, making sure everything gets there at the right time, in communication, because almost all teams have more than one person, and sometimes they have to work together in complicated ways. You need to do risk analysis, like making sure that you handle all the physics and that your art doesn't interfere with your physics. Sustaining enthusiasm for something this crazy is sometimes a challenge. And contingency planning. What happens if it's pouring rain all day? Will your electronics survive? Probably not. So, also quoting, I believe, Richard Feynman, there are many more ways to fail than to succeed, and kinetic sculpture racing helps bring that out. This was a pre-race prep meeting, this photo that you see, in 2008 from the team When Pigs Fly. So I'll talk a little bit about what I do before I pass it on to Joe. I lead the website and photography teams, among other things. Before the race, I create the spectator's guide. If you come and attend the race, I strongly encourage you to download it. It includes a map, it includes a list of entry, and includes information about the race. I first saw the race in 2001 because I visited the Visionary Art Museum and some of their publicity had some pictures of it. I took pictures in 2001 and posted them on my website. It was so much fun. I did the same in 2002. In 2003, I went to the Visionary Art Museum website and I couldn't find the start time. So I called the museum and asked them what time it started. The front desk people said that they'd have somebody call me back. A few minutes later, I was talking to race director Teresa Segretti, Mother Teresa, and I realized that maybe they needed a better publicity to help explain the race. So the next year, I, on my own, spontaneously created kineticbaltimore.com, the website that's there now, created the first ever spectator's guide, the first published schedule, and the first map of the race route. And crowds have grown since then, so I think it's been quite a successful endeavor. During the race, we lead a team of all-terrain photographers, and we carefully configure our cameras. Here are pictures of photographers. We include costumes. We have hard hats with yellow feathers on them that are the colors of the race. And we get in, you can see a picture of me standing in the water. We're on bicycles, we ride scooters, we stand on ladders. We have one photographer on a boat. We get out there and get involved and mixed up in the action. Recruiting photographers is actually pretty challenging because the all-terrain nature of the photographers is especially challenging. Photographers, in order to fully capture this race, have to also have quite a bit of stamina. Andy Carruthers, who I had mentioned earlier, was a career photojournalist. I asked him what kind of photographer was the best fit when we were looking to recruit new members. I said, like a news photographer like you? He said, no, news photographers don't have the stamina that's involved. An event photographer, not really. Sports photographers, he said they tend to just sit there from the sports box and take pictures without moving. Travel photographers, maybe. he thought about it, and a week later he said, I think you probably need a war photographer because they're the only ones who are as prepared for everything as you need to be in order to take great pictures at this race. And then finally, after the race, that's when my work really begins. For racers in the museum, they build everything up before the race, and then they get to relax afterward. My hard work begins. I take a full week off of work every year in order to go through thousands upon thousands of photos. This year, we had 8 photographers. We took 11,291 pictures. And I developed, I sorted, tagged, and developed the best 327 of them and published them on the website this year. I have ended up publishing quite a few, I've submitted quite a few crash tickets to Adobe for overloading their systems beyond what they like to handle. Fortunately, their current tools aren't too put off by 11,000 photos. But sometimes they bog down a little bit, and sometimes it turns into a challenge just to manage and process all of the data that's involved. A few more photos quickly before I pass it off to Joe. Sometimes sculptures fall apart during the race. This is Tempus Fugit from 2022. This was the year that it was pouring rain all year. It was super challenging, wet and cold that year. Coming out of the pandemic, this team, the Soda Quackers, they were the reigning champions. They expected to do really, really well with their sculpture, which was a time-traveling motorcyclist. But only a few miles into the race, the biker's head ran into a tree and fell off. You can see that this is a headless motorcyclist. That was not by design. The head is actually in the photo on the left because shortly after the picture on the right was taken, they broke an axle and they could not proceed further. They did not have a spare axle with them, nor the equipment to install it. So they ended up breaking down completely, and they crossed the finish line in the picture on the left. All of their crew, when the sculpture broke down, they just kept going. They did not stop. They brought whatever they could from the sculpture, and they crossed the finish line. And if you look closely in the picture on the left, you'll see there are 2 toddlers, 2 future kinetic racers, asleep in the stroller after a long rainy day of riding throughout the whole race on this stroller. So the racers get very enthusiastic, and this team shows a lot of spirit, even though the vast majority of their sculpture never made it across the finish line. Sometimes sculptures get into traffic jams. There's an option called ACE for serious racers where you follow a bunch of additional, more stringent rules. One of those rules is that you have to exit the water without any help. And so here you can see one of the racers from the Gemini School who is working very hard to get out of the water on his own power. And it took him so long that you can see there are several other sculptures queued up behind him. Some of the sculptures also turn out to be quite large. You can see this one is bigger than the city bus that is passing it. Platypus, this year it was Shark Tank Platypus in 2019, is David Hess's amazing 9-pilot sculpture. The pilots pedal bicycle pedals. That energy is fed into a Suzuki Samurai transmission, which powers an automotive powertrain with car tires and a paddle wheel on the back. Now I'll hand things over to Joe. He'll start with sculpture maintenance.
I will, but I just tailing off of the last thing, I want to, there was an entry about 10 years ago, I think, called the Galloping Cow that failed spectacularly on the road, and the people who brought it abandoned it. And we didn't know this at the time, but just random people out of the crowd took it over and finished the race with it, which was kind of amazing because it was completely super broken. So there is really a spirit kind of in these races. My name is Joe. I am, I don't know how to describe what I do with the museum. What I find sort of interesting is I got into AVAM by the most insane progression of accidents. I majored in poetry. Of course, I'm not making my living doing that because it's majoring in poetry. But I was working as a microfilm archivist and digital, I don't know what, the field has changed so much. I was basically doing preservation microfilming of ancient documents. We did a lot of work with the with the Walters and Will Knoll over there, who was famous for doing the Archimedes palimpsest. But as my side hustle, I was building theremins, which is the 1920s musical instrument you play without touching. I made a connection to a Baltimore composer who made a connection to AVAM and became their composer in residence for a year. And they brought me in to do some street theater, for want of a better term. There were it basically was an interpretive performance of artworks in the museum, but the museum just kept calling me back. And the kind of the key thing was with AVAM, you get once you get into their flow of things, you sort of don't say no to the things they ask you to do, no matter how ridiculous they are. The way I got in kind of for the Kinetic races, they called me in for the 1999 race. They knew I'd done some previous stuff. I'd done some installation work. They said, hey, at the beginning of this race, we want to have somebody come in dressed as a priest to give a blessing of the feet, which is sort of a play on words of the blessing of the fleet, which was sort of an old naval custom. And they got this group together. I had no idea what I was doing. I got out my sewing machine, whipped together a monk's habit, and I showed up, read a brief homily, and then go-go dance to the Al Hirt song Java. And after that, I was kind of doomed to be following the race forever. I see people talk about that burner lifestyle. I think we've got it in Baltimore as the Kinetic race lifestyle. It's just not as involved, and it's not quite so dry and hot where we end up. Tom, you can go to the next slide. Okay, so one of the things that they brought me in on, and this has led to me having more of an involved thing with AVAN, especially with the Kinetic races. In 2004, the museum is covered with an architectural mosaic. It is, I believe, the largest in the country in terms of a single applied mosaic. I'd been doing some installation stuff for them, building interactive artwork and maintaining things, and otherwise kind of anytime they had some sort of weird thing that nobody in the museum could figure out how to do, they would call me. They brought me in for the mosaic, and this project that you see in the slide here, this was 2 blank concrete walls, and we had a budget and a year, and this was a community project that was done with kids in drug rehab, post-incarceration, and related programs. So basically, over the course of a year, we drafted the mosaic. I was working with the artist Mari Gardner, who did the visual design and was a supervising instructor. There's a little inset picture there that has the mosaic as we drew it out. We hung it all the concrete panels to do it and put it together. This was a really interesting project because it was kind of half construction, half art, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. When time was crunched, I was working on the mosaic as an artist. Other times I was hanging stuff up in August, and I'd be holding a panel where sometimes it was so hot I thought I was going to pass out and drop it, which I didn't want to do. And weirdly, every dragonfly in the Inner Harbor area would just hover in front of the mirror day in and day out, just looking at themselves, either admiring their beauty or just going, oh, I'm gonna get you one of these days. But so I started working with them for a lot of the Kinetic things, kind of from an implementation standpoint, and what a lot of that came down to was the museum has a number of sculptures that are their in-house sculptures. So there's Fifi, there was Bumpo the elephant, there was a large frog and a large rat. The Fifi sculpture and the Bumpo sculpture were built on what they call a Rhodes car. It's a pedal-powered four-wheeler, and those are a little more robust in terms of engineering. The frog was less robust, and the rat was not entirely robust at all. Tom, you can go to the next slide there. So the key thing with all of these museums, all these Kinetic sculptures at the museum, is they are made of everything. by and large, the kind of core to this, you're not allowed to have an engine, you're not allowed to have electricity, you're not allowed to have a power source, you have to be able to pedal it. So most of what people do is work from bicycles. They tear them apart, they reconfigure them, they weld them together, they work with just their parts and construct basic stuff. There's also people, they get kind of involved in the engineering. They'll build their own wheels. So whenever you see a vehicle with really large wheels, a lot of times they'll be plywood with very strange like pool noodles on them and stuff holding them together. The key thing is you want to get it assembled to the point that it will at least survive long enough to get to the start of the race. After that, it becomes a problem for all of us. So, you know, the variety of things, the underpinnings are usually pretty similar. The problem Tom mentioned earlier, they have to be strong enough to get through the race, but light enough so that people can pedal them. Fifi, for instance, because she's based on this four-wheel, what they call a quadricycle frame, Fifi is way heavier than she looks. And when after the Mosaic project, the museum kept me on to be their facilities manager. And I jumped in, I said, I want to co-pilot Fifi. I want to co-pilot Fifi. And I was so excited. And for some reason, the year that I did it, I talked Teresa, and this is the aforementioned Mother Teresa. She's always the pilot. I talked her into doing it where we were in biker gear. And I'm like, oh, this is going to be so cool. It's like this great juxtaposition of like biker gear against the pink poodle. And we got in there, and man, the previous co-pilot had been our then art and our education director, who I think weighed about 90 pounds. And I thought, well, she can do it. I can do it. I got on there, and halfway up the hill, Teresa said, I knew there was a problem because you hadn't been talking in 20 minutes. And I'm like, oh God. But so much was involved because you have everything depends on a chain, a gear, all these little things. So there's a lot of maintenance that goes on during the race. There's a lot of things that fall apart during the race. They have very precise rules about what you're not allowed to do. And we actually have a team called the Kinetic Cops that will catch you doing things that you're not supposed to do. Although I think, Tom, are they specially for aces, or do they do everything? Oop. Oh, are you there, Tom?
Sorry, yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah, there are judges that issue tickets to normal sculptures, but the ace entries have one dedicated judge who watches them like a hawk the entire time. But
Okay.
yeah, there are cops that issue tickets to anybody for any kind of infraction, some of which are more picayune than others.
Yeah, and we've thrown a lot of them out of the window. It used to be that you weren't supposed to have more than a certain amount of your body in the water. But we've had an entry over the last few years who literally runs the whole way. He has this huge sculpture that might as well, I think it's made out of like balloons and pool noodles and stuff. And when it comes to the water entry, he just goes into the water and swims. And so the rules are very kind of loosely applied, except when you're going for this prestigious ACE award, which is usually kind of the younger people like that sort of, because it's a more traditional accomplishment. As far as the art side of this, people use everything. They use recycled materials. We've had ones where it's just like tons of soda bottles. They're just trash. I mean, we have the craziest materials that go into these. Fifi was originally designed, and they were thinking Teresa's suggestion was at the time was she wanted to make her out of cotton candy. So it would be, this big giant cotton candy dog, and then at the end of the race, everyone would eat her. This did not work out in reality. So she's actually made out of about 1,000 yards of pink tulle. So every year, anytime they have to redress her, the prom market gets into a lot of trouble because, they don't, or I don't know, do people wear tulle to prom dresses for prom dresses anymore? But so they use a ton of stuff. And some of this is you have to work out the survivability. Is it going to make it through the race? Is it going to make it through the first part of the race? And the other thing is, a lot of these sculptures will come back next year. So if it's something that you want to keep, are the materials going to last a year? And that, in this field is sort of funny because working at the museum, my I have a very I'm always bemused by the conservators that get pulled in to work on the museum, because if you're familiar with AVIM, it's outsider and visionary art, which means if you're coming in to do conservator work on a piece, you might be dealing with house paint on a cutout piece of an aluminum shed. It's the materials are just crazy, and I'm always fascinated by watching conservators adapt and take kind of the techniques that are available and make it work. You can go to the next slide, Tom. So in the actual race itself, the main thing is everything from the second you leave, often before you leave the finish line, the piece wants to break. It wants to not be alive, and it wants to be in pieces along the roadside. I love the Jean Cocteau quote I used here, this where he talks about fashion. He said, "Fashion dies very young, so we must forgive it everything." And this is definitely true of the kinetic sculpture race. All of these sculptures are doomed. Even the ones like Fifi is kind of the giant pink poodle of Theseus at this point. She has been redressed and redressed and redressed. The core is still the same every time, but she's kind of continuously evolving. If you look at a photo of her, the question is she a sculpture, or is she a pile of bicycles wearing a costume? As you go through the race, you can fail because of engineering. A lot of times it's really simple things like bicycle chains snapping. People have gotten wise now, and they're using bigger chains like most motorcycle chains and that sort of thing. When you're on the land, you have a couple steep hills to get up. That puts a lot of strain on your drivetrain. And then once you hit the water, it all goes haywire. A lot of times people have tested these, but gently. And in this, when you go in, you don't really test them gently here. You crash into the water. In my ride in Fifi, or my co-piloting of Fifi, I was unprepared as we hit the water for exactly how much inner harbor water was going to go into my mouth. And it is a lot. And I also had an entire case of Diet Mountain Dew up in the little rack over my head, and every single one of those flew out and hit me on the head before falling to the bottom of the harbor. So I apologize to the the biology of the harbor for my contribution of 24 cans of Diet Mountain Dew. The great thing about this, though, is because everybody knows their thing is going to kind of fall apart from the start. There is this real kind of human spirit thing that goes on. People are they're going to get through. Sometimes that means you're pushing a grinding, falling apart thing all the way through. There are occasionally ones where they come back on a trailer, but people will do anything they can to get them through. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, and then after the race, that's kind of where it gets fun, and that's where the whole idea of where these stand in the overall scheme of art comes in. The elephant pictured here, that's Bumpo. Bumpo is actually built on the same framework that's under Fifi and has a great sturdy frame. And I ended up doing a lot of maintenance and upgrades on Bumpo over the years. And the main problem was Bumpo was a mixture of braided weather stripping, and then this sort of strange fuzzy fabric that was used for his ears and stuff, that it just has like a short lifespan. So we had it in there, and the first time we took Bumpo out of the shed on a windy day, the ears just turned into frames. So there's always this question of, the museum sculptures were always kept on display because they're kind of showing off the kinetic sculpture race and kind of what the spirit of the museum is. And with those, it was a matter of how do we keep this thing going another year? Fifi has benefited from the whole concept of Fifi as an idea more than a thing. There's a Japanese temple that I always find fascinating in this regard, that it's been around for hundreds of years, but it's torn down and rebuilt every 20 years because the shrine there is the idea of the shrine and not the physical object. Fifi has most of her original parts, but you kind of wonder with her, Is there ever a point where she just freezes and becomes a fixed piece of art, or do you do conservation work with her like you would do with puppets and costumes, other things that are kind of dynamic but made of materials that might not be long lasting? The other racers in the event, the sculpture called the platypus, which didn't look like a platypus the last year and kind of becomes a lot of different things. They have this great framework, and every year David Hess comes up with kind of a new way that they're going to address it. So it, that piece is kind of an ephemeral sculpture. It's got a sturdy base, and then the rest of it changes as it needs to change. For the long term, though, if we want to preserve these things, a lot of it is a matter of replacing, doing some materials engineering to make sure that we're using things that actually will hold up over time, regardless of whether if they're going to be in the race, the standards are a little higher. If not, then you just try not to move them too much. And this always kind of gives me the question with these is a kinetic sculpture, is it a sculpture or is it a performance? Is it an ephemeral thing or is it a permanent thing? And I think the kind of jury is out on that to some extent. Okay, next one, Tom. I think that is okay. And I'd be really curious, one of the reasons I sort of suggested, if anybody wants to chime in with questions or anything like that, I'm always fascinated kind of from the other side of this in terms of, people who work in conserving art and maintaining it and dealing with kind of the archival qualities. I'm just curious to see if you guys have any commentary on that. So
yeah, we can address any questions, and then we'll wrap up with info about next year.
Sounds good.
Great. Thank you, both of you, Tom and Joe. That was really fantastic, and really looking forward to visiting this year. I guess I have one kind of silly question, but where did the Kinetic chicken mascot come from? Can you tell us the story of that?
So there was they attempted when they first drew it, and I think this is the way it started out in California. They tried to draw a kinetic eagle, and then somebody immediately said that looks a lot more like a chicken. So the logo that you see on our hats is actually the California chicken, because we could not cut 3M reflective engineer grade retro reflective material with the kind of detail that's needed for the Teutonic chicken that is the Baltimore take on that same thing. But it was designed to be a simple icon. I think it's evolved a little bit over the years into the nice shape that it has now. And but it started out as an eagle and then was very soon classified within the first few years as a chicken.
Great, that's excellent. We have a question from Kiara, and so the question for you, Tom. She says, do you know if there has ever been a sculpture that was raised in Northern California and in Baltimore?
I know that there have been people who have tried, but I am not aware of any that have, or actually, yes, I think there is one sculpture from Bob Berger, who I think lived in Frederick, Maryland. If I recall, one of the years I was not in California, he brought his solo pilot sculpture out to California and successfully raised it there. There have been a lot of people who have tried to have attempted the journey, but it's 3,000 miles, and bringing a heavy sculpture out and is quite a challenge. There's certainly interest in doing so, but I think the problem is that it presents a pretty healthy challenge, not least of which because the Baltimore race is the first Saturday in May, and the California race is Memorial Day weekend. So you've only got a couple weeks to do that transition, which makes it extra challenging.
Absolutely, and it's not something that you can just put on a plane and fly across.
Right? Yeah, you can't. It does not fit in checked baggage.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess we have a question from Rachel about how much time is spent working on Fifi every year.
That depends on the year. if you look at the Kinetic Baltimore website, Fifi's kind of fascinating because she's been completely redressed a few times. When she was originally constructed, it's with, you know, yards and yards and yards of gathered pink tulle, and after a few years, it was looking dingy, so they redressed it, and then they've done some redresses. They did kind of a space suit look where they redressed her with shiny mylar. They did one year where she was blue. Tom, what was she blue for again?
That was when she was Babe the Blue Ox.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. So she's Babe the Blue Ox. We actually there's a Fifi Junior, which is we were requested a lot of times to put Fifi on display, and we did. The only thing that was a problem was we could put her on display in places that we could pedal her, but because she's so big and dismantling her was practically impossible, we built like a little Fifi because in 2007 or 8, I'm vague on this, but we were invited to do an elaborate American Visionary Art Museum display at Bergdorf Goodman. So they gave us a big chunk of the Bergdorf Goodman windows, and we constructed this tiny little Fifi. She's not that tiny. She's still like 12 feet tall, specifically for that. There's a great picture somewhere on the website where and this shows my sporting ignorance, because we were in Bergdorf Goodman. We had the whole museum crew up there, and they said, oh, we should get a picture. And I handed the phone. I found a nice lady walking into Bergdorf Goodman, and I got her to take our picture. And then everybody yelled at me. They're like, that was Serena Williams. I'm like, oh, is she famous? Like, yes, you got Serena Williams to take our picture. Like, I don't know, it's probably refreshing for her. But every year they kind of fluff her up because they redress. Teresa takes her role kind of as, you know, Fifi is the flagship. So every year they get a new theme. There was a Rosie the Riveter year. There was the Genie year, which you saw in there. And they go full tilt with the costumes. They go, you know, they'll redress her as far as if she needs any kind of costuming. And in general, they'll continually replace the tulle because that gets just kind of gray and flat. And nobody wants to go out in public with their tulle all flat and gray. Well,
Not most of the time.
Yeah. But yeah, so and the thing is, leading up to Kinetic, it's always like all hands on deck at AVAM. So that's just part of the thing. Everybody who works there knows at some point they're going to be sitting there with little bundles of tulle helping to redress.
Nice. So that kind of has answered our next question of how much of Fifi or Bumpo do you retain year to year? And do you take the tool off Fifi at the end of the race? So if you don't have to replace it, do you keep the tool on?
Yeah, like on the years where she, you know, and on the years where she comes out looking okay, usually it's just to fluff it up. She's kept in the back of the James Rouse Visionary Center, which is our kind of art and education building, and so she's on display all year round. So she has to be presentable enough to be on display. We don't want to shame the museum. Bumpo reached the limit of his material lifespan. So his undercarriage is good, but he's actually been retired to the upper heart. We have like a storage space up in our what we call the Love Barn that is adjacent to the museum's meditation garden, and he's visible there. You know, he's on display there. But at this point, the last couple of times, every time I handled him, parts of him were falling off. So, and he was a bit of a handful because he's built taller than Fifi. He actually has a cage up in the top, because originally it was like people could ride up on the back of Bumpo, so he's extra strong, but it means he's extra heavy. And as we found out one year at the water entry, he is basically a huge sail. So he pedaled out to the end, and then the wind caught him and took him halfway to the asphalt transfer terminal there in Canton before people were able to get a rope on and pull him back.
That's excellent. I guess that Rachel's also asking, are sculptures not made by the museum ever displayed at the museum?
Yes. The museum, and I say we kind of collectively, even though I'm not, full-time with the museum at this point, but the museum's kind of policy is a lot of it just depends on if they have space or if a sculpture is just that amazing. I mean, we've had, excuse me, we had racers do a series of like horses. It was like a train of horses. Tom, can you tell me who that was? Was that Make Believers?
Yeah, that was the Make Believers.
And that one was one, if they're kind of judged by if they're artistically worth sharing all year round, then the museum will like pony up a little bit of quote unquote storage space, but it's also being able to share what they are. I think we've had a few smaller ones that come and go in that regard.
Nice. I guess I had a question then about storage. Do you store other sculptures, or are people required to store their own kinetic sculptures when they're not racing? How does that, because I imagine they're huge. They take up a lot of storage space.
Yeah, that's always sort of a funny, I wouldn't say it's a point of contention, but it the museum always you can bring them in the night before. A lot of people do, but it's space permitting because the museum has the barn and the JRVC, but there's kind of a limit of how much space. So usually the rule is people need to get them out by the next morning unless they've made a special arrangement. Tom, am I getting this correct?
Yeah, you're correct. It is often hard to find a big enough garage space. Some of them, like the platypus, that 9-person gigantic sculpture that was as big as a bus, David Hess has a gigantic studio where he builds artwork that is displayed outside and is on a similar scale. So he's quite lucky in that regard. There are other people who, in fact, have had to give up their sculptures, either because they moved to a smaller place without as large a garage, or because they wanted to give it away and make room to build a new one from scratch. In California, they're lucky enough. The 3 of the racers pooled together and have a large facility called the Kinetic Lab, which is actually a very large building that is both a workshop and a storage facility. And it has its roof is maybe 25 feet high, and so the rafters are filled. When you walk in overhead, there are old sculptures hanging down in all their magnificence. But yeah, there is an archive of physical former sculptures is really challenging, and it's usually up to the racers themselves to figure out where they can store them.
Yeah, I can understand that because storage is always an issue at any museum, I'm sure.
Especially for giant pieces.
Yeah, we can't quite go to Artex with some of these things. We in fact just I probably shouldn't mention that brand name specifically, but we had stuff stored where we had huge art cars that we had to store for the museum. There used to be a bus, like a huge bus created by Nancy Josephson, that we had stored there, and it was the only place for it was outside, and when things outside, it's degrading the whole time. So that is kind of the problem of making enormous art. Although I
saw that people powered bus that you saw out in the waves. And I saw that in the early 2000s, and it was in someone's backyard, and it had vines and trees and grass growing through it because there was no other place to put it.
I think that's sort of the afterlife of sculptures. A lot of times what people will do is off season, they'll sort of condense them down to parts and then use that as their build from the start.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, I think we are actually at time, or a little bit past time. So I'd like to thank you both for presenting. And I think everyone has really enjoyed it. And I think we're all really looking forward to attending the race in May. So thank you very much. And thank you everyone for attending, and hope to see you all at our next meeting.
Great. It'll be May 6th next year. See you in Baltimore.
Yeah, thanks for having us. And decorate your bike. If you want to just come and ride a bike, that is super fun, and that's the perfect way to get into it. It's the ride is relatively relaxed, and then you do nothing for an hour at each entry point. So it's perfect.
Excellent. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.